Imagine a massive iron gate, forged into a wall of cold, unyielding stone. You can hear the heavy, metallic grinding as the lock turns, historical valleys, and final cosmic judgments. But instead of preserving those distinct categories, they translated almost all of them using a single, Old Germanic word, hell. By doing this, they collapsed the timeline of eternity into a single, terrifying image. Hades is a temporary state of waiting. Gehenna is the final state of judgment. Hades is the holding cell where disembodied souls await the physical resurrection. Gehenna is the ultimate, cosmic execution of evil at the very end of human history. Biblically speaking, no human being is in Gehenna right now. Confusing the temporary waiting room with the final incinerator completely distorts the biblical architecture of death. Hades is not the lake of fire. It is the locked room where the dead reside until the end of the age. But this creates a new, pressing question. If Hades and Gehenna are different, and Hades is merely a temporary holding place, what actually happens to a human soul while it is locked inside? Is it a uniform experience of shadowy silence for every person, righteous and wicked alike? Does a brutal dictator experience the same intermediate state as a faithful prophet? The silence of the Old Testament, Sheol does not last forever. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus pulls back the curtain on the unseen realm. He tells a story that maps the exact architecture of the waiting room. Two men live parallel lives just yards away from each other. One sits behind the heavy wooden doors of his estate, clothed in purple linen. By compressing these distinct biblical locations into one blunt concept, we have lost the actual map of the unseen world. The original writers understood, and feasting in luxury. The other lies in the dirt at the gate, covered in open sores, feeling the rough tongues of street dogs as he starves. Then, both of their lives end. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus tells the story of the rich man and Lazarus. It is one of the most vivid, unsettling glimpses into the unseen world found anywhere in Scripture. When the two men close their eyes in physical death, they do not bypass the intermediate state. They both descend into the realm of the dead. But when they open their eyes, they discover that the waiting room is not a uniform experience. The text explicitly states that the rich man finds himself in Hades. But he is not resting, in silent shadows. He is in conscious torment. When he looks up, he sees a radically different reality playing out just out of reach. He sees Abraham, the great patriarch of the Jewish faith, and resting safely at his side in a place of profound honor and comfort is Lazarus the beggar. Here, Jesus adds a vital layer to the architecture of death. Hades is not a flat, monotonous cavern where the righteous and the wicked share the exact same fate. The intermediate state contains a clear, absolute division. On one side is a place of comfort, often called Abraham's bosom or paradise. It is a sanctuary of rest for those who belong to God. On the other side is a place of conscious regret and anguish, avast. Critical difference between the ancient Hebrew concept of Sheol, the Greek realm of Hades, the burning historical valley of Gehenna, for those who spent their lives rejecting their Creator. But the detail that cuts deepest comes next. The rich man begs for a single drop of water to cool his tongue. He asks Abraham to send Lazarus across the divide, but Abraham shakes his head. He replies, "Between us and you, a great chasm has been set in place, so that those who want to go from here to you cannot, nor can anyone cross over from there to us." The Greek word used here is chasma, a yawning, impassable gulf, an abyss. Up to this point, our question has been historical. We have traced the Old Testament, Sheol, translated it into the Greek Hades, and carefully separated it from the final, eternal fires of Gehenna. But here, at the midpoint of the story, the stakes suddenly escalate. The unseen realm is not merely a linguistic puzzle, it is a place of conscious consequence. The waiting room is divided, and the chasm cannot be crossed by human effort. Both the righteous and the wicked are waiting for the final resurrection of the body, but they are waiting in entirely different conditions. Yet, a massive problem remains. Whether in comfort or in torment, both Lazarus and the rich man are still inside Hades. The realm of the dead still holds them. The chasm prevents crossing, and the heavy iron gates of Hades are locked securely from the inside. The dead cannot free themselves. If the gates are never opened, there can be, and the spiritual prison of Tartarus. But in older English Bibles, these four distinct realities were painted with the exact same brush. No physical resurrection, no final judgment, and no new creation. Humanity is trapped in the waiting room. Someone must break the gates open. To find out who possesses that kind of power, we have to travel north of Jerusalem, to the base of a massive stone cliff. It is there, surrounded by the temples of pagan gods, that Jesus makes a startling promise about the architecture of death. Stand at the base of Mount Hermon, in the northern region of Caesarea Philippi. A towering wall of red and gray limestone rises hundreds of feet into the sky. At the base of this massive cliff gapes a dark, deep cave, from which a rushing spring of cold water flows. In the 1st century, this was a center of pagan worship. The ancients believed this watery cavern was a literal, physical doorway to the underworld. They called it the gate to the unseen realm. Jesus intentionally leads his disciples on a long, arduous journey out of Jewish territory, just to stand in the shadow of this intimidating rock. He looks at his closest followers and asks a defining question. "Who do you say I am?" Peter answers, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus responds with a statement that has been quoted for 2,000 years, but almost universally misunderstood. He points toward the massive cliff and declares in Matthew 16, "On this rock I will build my church." A temporary waiting room for the dead and the final lake of fire were given the exact same English name. This translation trap has caused immense confusion, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. Because of the translation trap, most English readers have spent centuries hearing, "The gates of hell shall not prevail against it." And because of that translation, the common interpretation is entirely defensive. We picture the church as a fragile, frightened fortress, constantly under siege by demonic armies. We imagine fiery forces marching out of hell, battering against the walls of the church, while Christians hold on for dear life, hoping to survive the onslaught. But one detail completely destroys that image. Think about the ancient architecture of war. Gates do not attack. Gates do not march across a battlefield. Gates are heavy, stationary, defensive structures. They are designed to do two things: keep invading armies out, and keep prisoners securely locked inside. Jesus is not picturing the church as a terrified group of survivors huddled behind a barricade. He is picturing the exact opposite. He explicitly uses the word Hades, the realm of the dead, the ancient waiting room of Sheol. Hades is the prison holding all of humanity hostage under the curse of death. When Jesus says the gates of Hades will not overcome the church, he is declaring an invasion. The church is the attacking army. The church is moving forward, armed with the gospel of life, battering down the gates of the grave, and rescuing the hostages trapped inside. The heavy iron doors of death will not be strong enough to withstand the assault. It is why people struggle to understand the timeline of eternity. We have taken the temporary reality of human death and confused it. This is not a story of defensive survival. It is a story of ultimate liberation. The great equalizer of humanity is about to be overthrown. But this incredible promise creates a massive logistical problem. Even an empowered church cannot storm a supernatural prison if the doors are permanently locked. Human hands cannot break the iron bars of mortality. No amount of human willpower can force the gates of Sheol to open. If the church is going to plunder the realm of the dead, someone with cosmic authority must first go inside, defeat the ancient warden, and shatter the locks. The gates must be unhinged from the inside. To accomplish that, the Son of God could not merely teach about the unseen realm. He had to cross the chasm. He had to submit to the great equalizer. He had to die. Which brings us to the darkest, most profound, and most deeply misunderstood day in the entire Christian calendar. It is the silence of Saturday. The blood on the Roman cross has dried. A heavy stone has been rolled across the entrance of a garden tomb, sealing a lifeless body in the dark. To the soldiers standing guard and the disciples hiding behind locked doors, the story is over. The great equalizer has claimed another victim. The gates of the grave have slammed shut, with the final, eternal judgment of evil. This is not ultimately a story about the terrifying architecture of eternal punishment. But while the physical body of Jesus lies wrapped in linen and spices, the New Testament reveals that a cosmic invasion is taking place in the unseen world. When Jesus exhaled, his final breath and his human soul left his physical body. He did not bypass the reality of human death. He descended into the intermediate state. He entered Hades. For centuries, many have misunderstood this event, historically called the harrowing of hell. Influenced by the translation trap, popular imagination pictures Jesus plunging into the fiery lake of Gehenna, surrounded by demons, suffering in the flames to finish paying for human sin before fighting his way out. But the biblical text paints an entirely different picture. Jesus told the thief on the cross, "Today you will be with me in paradise." When his soul entered the unseen realm, he did not go to the side of torment. He went to the place of comfort, to the side of the righteous dead. But he did not enter the waiting room as a helpless captive. He entered it as the Lord of life. 60 years later, the resurrected Jesus appears to the Apostle John on the rocky island of Patmos. His eyes are like blazing fire. His voice is like rushing waters. And he makes a declaration that changes the architecture of eternity forever. In Revelation 1:18, Jesus says, "It is a story about the temporary nature of death and Christ's absolute authority over the grave." The central question we must answer is this: I am the living one. I was dead. And now look, I am alive forever and ever, and I hold the keys of death and Hades. Notice the specific word, not Gehenna. Hades, the ancient prison of the dead, is no longer under the control of the grave. The gates have been breached. The locks have been shattered from the inside out. By descending into the realm of the dead, and then rising again in a physical, glorified body on Sunday morning, Jesus Christ effectively ripped the gates of Hades off their hinges. He walked into the dark, silent waiting room of Sheol and took the keys. This is the hidden mechanism of our hope. This is why the church can storm the gates. The barrier of death is no longer unbreakable. For those who belong to Christ, the intermediate state is no longer a dark, shadowy prison, because the King has already been there. The realm of the dead has been fundamentally transformed. To be absent from the body is now to be intimately present with the Lord. The gates cannot hold them, because the one who loves them controls the locks. That would be a magnificent place to end the story. But one devastating contradiction remains. If Christ holds the keys, and if he has already conquered Hades, why do human beings still die? If the fiery underworld of popular imagination is a compressed version of different biblical concepts, what actually is Hades? What happens in the realm? Why are tears still falling in hospital rooms? Why are stones still being carved and lowered into the dirt today? If the waiting room has been invaded, what is its final, permanent fate? To find the answer, we must look past the empty tomb in Jerusalem. The Apostle John sees the ultimate resolution at the very end of the biblical story. Step forward to the very edge of human history. The Apostle John, still standing on the rocky shores of Patmos, is given a vision of the final culmination of time. The skies roll back. A great white throne appears, radiating a light so intense that earth and sky flee from its presence. And at the foot of that throne, the ultimate fate of the unseen realm is finally decided. In Revelation chapter 20, the final judgment begins, but before the books are opened, a massive cosmic shift must occur. John writes, "The sea gave up the dead that were in it. And death and Hades gave up the dead that were in them. And the person was judged according to what they had done. This is the moment the temporary waiting room is permanently emptied. Of the dead between the moment of our passing and the final culmination of history? To answer that, we must follow the trail of a specific symbol. The keys that Jesus Christ took on Holy Saturday are finally used to unlock the iron gates for the very last time. Every soul that has ever existed in the intermediate state is called out. The ancient, shadowy realm of Sheol is completely evacuated. When death and Hades surrender their captives, it proves that the grave never had ultimate ownership over humanity. It was only ever a temporary tenant. But it is the very next verse that completely shatters the popular, cultural understanding of the afterlife. John writes, "Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. The lake of fire is the second death. Look closely at what is happening. Hades is thrown into the lake of fire." This is exactly why the translation trap we explored at the beginning has been so incredibly destructive. If you translate both of these distinct realities simply as hell, the sentence becomes absolute nonsense. Then hell was thrown into hell. But when you recover the precise biblical geography, the timeline of eternity suddenly makes perfect sense. The lake of fire is Gehenna, the final state of irreversible judgment. Hades is the temporary holding cell, sealing shut, echoing in the dark. For thousands of years, this was the ultimate human nightmare. It is the gate that opens only one way, that runs from the first pages of Scripture to the last, the keys and the gates. The ancient world believed that whoever holds the keys, at the end of history, God does not just judge rebellious humanity. He judges death itself. The great equalizer is led to the executioner's block. The waiting room is thrown into the incinerator. The heavy iron gates. The shadows. The silence of the grave. The deep chasm. All of it is violently discarded. It is utterly eradicated from the universe. As the Apostle Paul declared in his letter to the Corinthians, the last enemy to be destroyed is death. God is not going to preserve the realm of the dead. He is going to completely dismantle it, ensuring that his new creation is entirely free from its shadow. The theological pattern is now complete. The architecture of eternity has been accurately mapped. We have traced the journey from the ancient silence of Sheol to the divided waiting room of Hades, to the empty tomb of Christ, and finally to the ultimate destruction of death in Gehenna. We know exactly how the biblical story ends, but theology without application is merely history. The question is no longer what happens to Hades at the end of time. The question is what this means for you, right now, today. How does, to this unseen realm, holds the ultimate, unbreakable power over human existence? Most readers ask what hell looks like. The deeper question is how. This ancient blueprint changed the way you face a world where hospitals still operate, where disease still strikes, and where the physical reality of mortality still waits at the end of every human life. The ancient fear of the unseen realm can finally be laid to rest. For generations, we have allowed a translation error to dictate our deepest fears. By collapsing the entire biblical map of the afterlife into a single image of eternal fire, we inadvertently gave the grave far more power than it actually possesses. We assumed that death immediately handed humanity over to a terrifying Armanet architecture. But the biblical pattern tells a vastly different, much more triumphant story. The ancient writers were right to understand that human death leads to an intermediate state, a waiting room called Sheol in Hebrew, and Hades in Greek, where souls await the final culmination of history. But that waiting room is not permanent. It was invaded by a conquering king. Its keys were seized by the Son of God, and its final destiny is to be completely annihilated in the eternal fires of Gehenna. This changes everything about how you face mortality. When you sit in a quiet hospital room listening to a loved one's breathing slow down, or when you stand beside a fresh plot of earth in the cold rain, the grief is profound. The physical separation is agonizing. The realm of the dead functions in the biblical timeline, because if Hades is not the final lake of fire, then the story. We are right to weep, just as Jesus wept outside the tomb of his friend. But for the Christian, the despair does not have to be absolute. What is the pressure of mortality revealing in your own heart? What are you actually afraid of when you think about the end of your physical life? Are you afraid of an endless, terrifying punishment? Are you afraid of a dark, silent isolation away from the presence of God? The scriptural text confronts those fears directly. If you belong to Christ, the intermediate state is no longer a dark, locked cavern of shadows. You do not descend into a forgotten underworld. Because Jesus entered Hades and broke its power, the waiting room has been fundamentally altered. You step into the immediate, conscious presence of the Lord. Think back to that massive iron gate we imagined at the very beginning. The cold, unyielding barrier forged into a stone wall, locking the living out and the dead in. For thousands of years, humanity stood before that gate, in absolute terror, knowing it only opened one way. Look at that gate again. The stone wall is still there, because physical death is still a temporary reality in this age. But the heavy iron doors have been violently torn from their hinges. The locks are shattered. The chains lie broken on the floor. And standing in the threshold is the resurrected Christ, holding the keys in his own hands. Of what Jesus Christ accomplished on the darkest weekend in history has been drastically misunderstood by millions of modern Christians. The familiar interpretation: he is not a warden keeping you locked inside. He is the liberator who guarantees you will not stay there. This was never ultimately a story about the terrifying architecture of eternal punishment. It is the story of a God who invaded the darkest, most inescapable human reality and dismantled it from the inside out. He did not simply send a message of comfort from a safe distance. He walked into the silence of the grave, took its authority, and promised to one day throw the entire realm of death into the fire. You no longer have to fear the dark behind the gates, because the one who holds the keys is already there. If this journey through Scripture has helped replace a theology of fear with a theology of hope, consider subscribing to the channel and sharing this study with someone who needs it today. Is not entirely wrong. It is simply incomplete. We have fundamentally misunderstood the architecture of death. We have assumed that the moment a person dies, the story immediately ends in a permanent state of fire or clouds. But the biblical text reveals an intermediate state, a realm of shadows, a place of waiting, guarded by locked iron gates. To understand how the New Testament writers viewed this unseen realm, we cannot start in the Greek world of the first century. We first have to strip away the medieval paintings of pitchforks and flames. We have to walk into the ancient Hebrew mind. Before we can understand the gates of Hades, we must stand in the arid, stony landscape of the ancient Near East. It locks the living out, and it locks the dead in. If you grew up in a Western culture, you likely have a very specific image. When an ancient Israelite buried a loved one, sealing them behind a heavy limestone rock, they did not imagine that soul ascending immediately into a realm of golden streets, nor did they imagine them plunging into a cavern of torture and demons. They envisioned a descent into something far more mysterious. They called it Sheol. The Hebrew word Sheol appears 65 times in the Old Testament. Depending on the English Bible you are reading, the translators may have rendered it as the grave, the pit, destruction, or even hell. But to the ancient Hebrew mind, Sheol was more than a physical hole in the dirt. It was the shadowy underworld, the gathering place of departed spirits. It was the ultimate, unavoidable equalizer of human existence. Here is the detail that contradicts almost everything modern culture assumes about the afterlife. In the Old Testament, everyone went to Sheol. The wicked went there. But so did the most righteous prophets and patriarchs. When Jacob believed his favored son Joseph had been torn apart by wild animals, his grief was absolute. He refused to eat, refused to be comforted, and declared in Genesis 37, "I shall go down to Sheol to my son." Mourning. Jacob did not believe his beloved. righteous son, was burning in a lake of fire. He believed Joseph was in the unseen realm of the dead, of what lies behind that gate. You picture a subterranean cavern of unquenchable fire. You imagine a realm of smoke, demons, and torment, and Jacob expected to join him there. Job, in the midst of his agonizing physical suffering, actually begged God to hide him in Sheol as a place of relief. King David wrote repeatedly of the gates of Sheol, and the cords of the grave tangling around his ankles. In these ancient texts, Sheol is never characterized by unquenchable fire or active demonic punishment. Instead, it is characterized by dust, weakness, shadows, and above all, deep silence. The psalmist writes, in Psalm Sata vi sitoista, the dead do not praise the Lord, nor do any who go down into silence. The inhabitants of Sheol were entirely cut off from the land of the living and from the vibrant, musical worship of the temple in Jerusalem. They were viewed as existing in a diminished state, sleeping in the dark, waiting behind doors that no human could ever open. The ancient Israelites understood that the grave was a one-way journey. The gates of Sheol were heavily locked, and humanity did not possess the key. This was not their final theology of eternal judgment. This was the theology of the great waiting room. Sheol was the sobering reality that death claimed every king, every priest, and every beggar, placing them all under the same earth, behind the same impenetrable barrier. For centuries, this silent, shadowed view of the afterlife, heavily influenced by medieval art, Renaissance poetry, and Dante's Inferno. We call this place hell, and most readers assume that when the Bible speaks, stood as the permanent reality of the human condition. The Israelites trusted God, but the gates of the grave remained securely closed. But empires rise and fall, and eventually, languages shift. When Alexander the Great marched his armies across the known world, he brought a culture and a language that would completely rewrite how the Jewish people spoke about the unseen world. 3 centuries before the birth of Christ, Jewish scholars gathered in Egypt to translate their ancient Hebrew scriptures into Greek, and as they translated, they had to find a single Greek word to describe this silent, locked waiting room. Sheol was about to be given a new name. Picture a group of Jewish scholars in the ancient, sunlit libraries of Alexandria, Egypt, 3 centuries before the birth of Christ. They are unrolling fragile parchment scrolls, translating the sacred Hebrew text into Greek, the new universal language of the empire. As their ink touches the papyrus, they face a profound linguistic challenge. When they read the Hebrew word Sheol, the dark, silent waiting room of the dead, they must find an accurate Greek equivalent. The word they select will eventually become the exact vocabulary used by Jesus, Peter, and Paul in the New Testament. They chose the word Hades. The Greek term is Hades, tatatatis, in its most literal, etymological sense. It simply means the unseen place, about the afterlife. It uses one unified word to describe this final, terrifying destination. We assume that the moment a person closes their eyes, the translation is accurate in its geography. But when older English Bibles translate Hades merely as hell, a catastrophic shift occurs. The English word hell forces the modern reader to instantly picture demons, pitchforks, and eternal flames. But the original Greek expression carries no inherent implication of fire or final punishment. It simply describes a realm that is completely invisible to the eyes of the living. To the surrounding pagan Greek culture, Hades was not just a destination, it was a deity. Hades was the grim god of the underworld, ruling over a subterranean kingdom, guarded by a monstrous hound and locked behind impenetrable iron gates. But the Jewish translators were fiercely monotheistic. They ruthlessly stripped away the pagan mythology. They did not adopt Hades as a rival god. They merely borrowed the architectural imagery of a locked, unseen world. To the Jewish mind, Hades became the exact Greek equivalent of Sheol. It was the hidden realm where the dead wait, still completely under the sovereign. unbreakable authority of the God of Israel. We see this clearly in the ancient translations of the Psalms. When King David originally wrote in Hebrew, "You will not abandon my soul to Sheol," the Greek translators rendered it, "You will not abandon my soul to Hades." This single linguistic choice changes how you read the entire New Testament. When the biblical writers use the word Hades, in death, they bypass any waiting period and are immediately dragged into this fiery abyss. The problem is not that the biblical writers were silent. They are never talking about the final lake of fire. They are talking about the temporary, invisible waiting room of the disembodied dead. The gates of Hades are the exact same barrier as the gates of Sheol. They represent the locked, unyielding finality of the grave. And just like Sheol, ancient Jewish theology understood that everyone who died entered this unseen realm. It was an intermediate state. The timeline of eternity had a middle step. It was not the final destination, it was the holding area where humanity waited for the resurrection of the body and the final judgment of God. But this linguistic reality creates a jarring contradiction. If Hades is simply the silent, unseen waiting room of the dead, why does Jesus speak so often and so violently about unquenchable fire, eternal destruction, and the worm that does not die? If Hades is not the lake of fire, where did that terrifying, burning imagery come from? The answer is that when Jesus spoke about final, fiery judgment, he did not use the word Hades. He used a completely different word, one that referred not to an invisible spiritual realm, but to a very physical, ash-covered geography. To understand the fires of final judgment, we must leave the unseen realm of spirits, about the afterlife. The problem is that centuries of translation have completely flattened their geography. When early English translators approached the ancient scriptures, step back into the blazing Middle Eastern sun, and walk to a very real valley just outside the walls of Jerusalem. Walk just outside the southern walls of ancient Jerusalem, and the ground drops sharply away. You are standing on the edge of a deep, narrow ravine. Today, the hot sun beats down on rocky soil. But in the time of the Old Testament kings, this trench was the site of Israel's darkest, most unthinkable spiritual treason. This was the Valley of Hinnom. It was here, in the shadows of the city walls, that kings Ahaz and Manasseh erected hollow bronze statues to the pagan god Molech. It was here that heavy metallic drums beat loudly to drown out the cries of children being sacrificed in the fire. The idolatry was so horrific, so deeply offensive to God, that the prophet Jeremiah cursed the geography itself. He declared that it would no longer be called the Valley of Hinnom, but the Valley of Slaughter. The righteous King Josiah eventually desecrated the site to stop the sacrifices, turning it into a dumping ground for the city's refuse and the unburied corpses of criminals. It became a place of constant smoldering fires, rotting decay, and ash. They made a decision that forever altered the way we read the Bible. They encountered 4 entirely different ancient words describing temporary holding places. In Hebrew, Valley of Hinnom is Gehenna. When that geographic name is brought into the Greek language of the New Testament, it becomes one terrifying, universally recognized word, Gehenna. When Jesus stood before the crowds in the first century and warned them about the fires of judgment, he did not point to the unseen spiritual waiting room of Hades. He pointed to the smoking, cursed valley right outside their own city gates. He warned them about Gehenna. Jesus used the historical memory of this valley as a vivid, undeniable metaphor for the final, eternal judgment of God. When he spoke of the place where their worm does not die and the fire is not quenched, he explicitly used the word Gehenna. When he warned that it is better to lose a hand or an eye than for the whole body to be thrown into the fire, he used the word Gehenna. Gehenna is the place of final, irreversible destruction for everything that rebels against the Creator. But here is the detail that completely changes how you read the Bible. Hades and Gehenna are not the same place. They are not even the same event. The catastrophic error of early English translations was rendering both of these distinct words simply as hell.